The Council declared war on humans and ignited their own doom. Part 2. The First Blow. 30 cycles after the vote, the Council's coalition fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Bleeker's Reach system. 12,000 warships rippled into real space, like stones falling into still water, each one trailing a faint blue glow as their engines cooled from the jump. War Marshal Draven Cole stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Wrath of Oronthus, and watched the system appear on his tactical display. Bleeker's Reach was a mining colony on a cold, gray world orbiting a dim red star. It was one of humanity's outermost settlements, home to roughly 40,000 people who spent their days pulling rare metals from deep underground. It was small, it was remote, and Cole had chosen it as his first target for exactly those reasons. He wanted an easy victory to open the campaign, something quick and clean that would send a message to the rest of human space. But something was wrong. His sensor officers reported it within the first few minutes. There were no ships in the system, no patrol vessels, no orbital defense platforms, no civilian transports. The colony on the surface showed minimal power signatures, as if the buildings were running on emergency generators and nothing else. The space around the planet was completely empty. "They abandoned it," said one of Cole's advisors, a thin Vaxi officer with pale, translucent skin. "They must have known we were coming and evacuated." Cole said nothing. He stared at the display and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. A small, cold knot in the back of his mind. It was not quite fear. It was closer to doubt. In all his years of putting down rebellions and crushing resistance movements, no one had ever simply left before he arrived. Species that were about to be conquered did one of two things. They fought or they surrendered. They did not vanish. "Move the fleet forward," Cole ordered. "Standard formation. Full sensor sweep of the system." The coalition fleet advanced slowly into the Bleeker's Reach system. 12,000 ships spread across millions of kilometers of space, their formations tight and disciplined. Cole had organized them into 3 main battle groups, each one led by a command carrier from a different council species. The Drenari held the left flank. The Kethrin held the right. Cole's own forces formed the center. Behind them, a long tail of supply ships and fuel transports stretched back toward the jump point. They had traveled roughly halfway to the planet when the problem started. It began with the sensors. Navigation data that had been clean and reliable since the jump suddenly became unstable. Star positions shifted on the displays. Distance calculations flickered and changed. Several ships reported that their long-range sensors were returning ghost readings, contacts that appeared for a moment and then vanished. Communication between ships grew static and unreliable. Officers had to repeat orders 2 and 3 times to be heard. Cole's chief science officer, a Tasari female with 6 arms and a nervous disposition, ran a diagnostic and reported that an unknown energy field was saturating the entire system. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was artificial, broadcast from sources she could not locate. The field was interfering with every electronic system in the fleet at a level so subtle that their countermeasures could not filter it out. "Can you shut it down?" Cole demanded. "I do not even know what it is," the science officer replied. Then the mines activated. They came from everywhere at once. Thousands of small devices, no larger than a human fist, hidden inside asteroid fragments, buried in orbital debris, disguised as dead rock and scrap metal. They had been placed months ago, maybe years ago, scattered across the entire system in a pattern so wide and so dense that the fleet had been flying through them without knowing it. The mines did not explode. They pulsed. Each one released a focused burst of electromagnetic energy that was tuned to the specific shield frequencies used by Council warships. The pulses ripped through energy shields like they were made of paper, and burned out sensor arrays, weapon systems, and navigation computers in a single flash. 300 ships were hit in the first wave. Some went completely dark, their power systems overloaded, their crews left floating in zero gravity as emergency lighting flickered and died. Others lost engines and began to drift. A Kethran destroyer collided with a Drenari cruiser as both ships lost navigation at the same moment, and the explosion lit up the darkness for 100 kilometers in every direction. Panic spread through the fleet. Ships broke formation to avoid the mines. Captains shouted over jammed communication channels for orders that nobody could hear clearly. The neat, disciplined formation that Cole had built over 30 cycles fell apart in minutes. And then the humans came. From behind the fourth planet's largest moon, 40 warships emerged. They were small compared to the massive council carriers, sleek, angular vessels painted in dark gray, with no decoration and no markings except simple hull numbers. At the front of the formation was the Ironclad, commanded by Captain Daniel Holt. Holt sat in his command chair on the bridge and watched the chaos unfolding on his tactical display. He did not smile. He did not show any emotion at all. He simply studied the patterns of the disrupted fleet, noted the positions of the command ships, and gave his orders in a calm, even voice that carried no more urgency than if he were ordering lunch. All ships, weapons free. Priority targets are command carriers and communication relays. Ignore the escorts. Hit them where they think. The 40 human warships accelerated into the gap in the council formation like a knife sliding between ribs. They moved in tight groups of 4 and 5, covering each other, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted by the larger council vessels. Their weapons were precise and brutal. Concentrated energy beams that punched through weakened shields and tore into the hulls of ships 10 times their size. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Garrett worked her tactical console with both hands, her eyes moving across 3 separate displays at once. She had studied Council fleet doctrine for years, and she could read their movements the way a musician reads notes on a page. She saw the patterns forming before the enemy commanders even decided on them. The Drenari group is trying to regroup on the left, she called out. They are going to rotate their carriers behind the escort screen. If we hit the 2 lead escorts now, the carriers will be exposed for about 90 seconds. Holt nodded. Do it. 2 human destroyers broke from the main group and fired a concentrated salvo at the Drenari escorts. Both enemy ships lost shields and veered off, trailing fire and debris. Behind them, the Drenari carriers sat exposed and vulnerable. The Ironclad and 3 other human cruisers poured fire into them for exactly 87 seconds before pulling back. 2 carriers were destroyed. A third was crippled. On the other side of the battle, Sergeant Eddie Voss was doing something much more personal. His Marine squad, 12 men and women in heavy combat armor, had been launched from the Ironclad in a boarding pod aimed at a crippled Council intelligence vessel. The pod hit the enemy ship's hull with a sound like a giant hammer striking a bell. Cutting torches burned through the outer plating, and the squad poured inside. The corridors of the Council ship were dark and filled with smoke. Emergency alarms screamed in a language Voss did not understand. His squad moved fast, clearing rooms and junctions with practiced efficiency. They met resistance, a group of Kethran soldiers armed with energy rifles, and put them down in a short, sharp firefight that lasted less than a minute. Voss found the ship's data core in a secured room near the center of the vessel. He pulled the entire memory unit from its housing, shoved it into a reinforced carrying case, and slapped a set of timed charges on the walls. Package secured, he reported over the communication channel. Charges set. We are leaving. The squad extracted back to their pod and launched away from the Council ship just as the charges detonated. The vessel broke apart behind them, a brief flash of orange and white that was swallowed by the darkness of space. Back on the Wrath of Aranthis, Cole was shouting orders. He still had overwhelming numbers. Even with the losses from the mines and the human strike, he commanded thousands of ships against only 40. He began pulling his forces together, using his center group as an anchor, and bringing the flanks in to create a closing wall that the human ships could not escape. Holt saw it coming. Sophie Garrett had already predicted it. "They are tightening the net," she said. "We have about 4 minutes before they cut off our exit corridor." "Then we leave in 3, Holt replied. The human strike group pulled back in perfect order, every ship covering the one behind it, firing as they withdrew to keep the Council forces from pursuing too closely. They reached the edge of the minefield, slipped through a pre-marked safe corridor, and jumped to faster-than-light speed. The battle was over. It had lasted less than 2 hours. Cole stood on his command deck, surrounded by damage reports. Over 900 Council ships were destroyed or disabled. Fuel reserves had been hit. 3 command carriers were gone. A critical intelligence vessel had been captured and then destroyed. And the humans, all 40 of their ships, had escaped. Humanity had lost 6 vessels. 6. The command deck was silent. Officers stared at their screens or looked at the floor. Nobody wanted to speak first. Finally, a young Tasari communications officer turned to a colleague at the next station and whispered something that the translation system picked up and broadcast across the deck before anyone could stop it. They were waiting for us. They wanted us to come. Cole heard it. Every officer on the deck heard it, and nobody corrected the young officer, because every single one of them knew it was true. Somewhere in the darkness of faster-than-light travel, aboard the ironclad, Eddie Voss sat in the cargo bay with the captured data core on his lap. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye, and his armor was scorched and dented. One of his squad members, a young woman named Katie Park, handed him a field bandage. "How did it go?" she asked. Voss pressed the bandage to his cut and looked down at the data core, the entire communication and navigation database of the Council's intelligence network, sitting right there in his hands. "I think," he said with a tired grin, "they are going to be very upset when they figure out what we just took." The Council declared war on humans and ignited their own doom. Part 3. The Doctrine of Broken Chains. The news of the disaster at Bleeker's Reach spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The Council tried to control the story. They called it a minor setback, a single engagement that meant nothing in the larger war. They pointed to their remaining fleet of over 11,000 ships and reminded everyone that the humans still had fewer than 300. Nobody believed them. Numbers on a report were one thing. 900 wrecked ships drifting in the dark were something else entirely. The species of the Council had seen wars before, but they had never seen anything like this, a fleet outnumbered 30-1 that had walked into a trap, torn the enemy apart, and walked out again with barely a scratch. In the halls of the Council station on Aranthis, whispers began to spread. The Ven delegates spoke quietly to each other, in their own language, and what they said would have made Jirenthal's blood run cold if he had heard it. The Tasari Trade Guild sent private messages to their homeworlds, asking uncomfortable questions about supply contracts and insurance policies. And the Umi, who had always been the quietest and most obedient of the tributary species, said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, the most alarming thing of all. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains on Earth, Admiral Nate Dawson sat in a plain room with bare concrete walls and a single table. Across from him sat Dr. Lillian Cross. She had arrived from Mars 12 hours ago on a fast transport, and she still looked tired from the trip. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But her hands were steady, and her voice was clear. The data core that Sergeant Voss captured is better than we hoped. Full communication logs, fleet deployment schedules, supply chain routes, and this is the important part. The complete navigation cipher that the Council uses to coordinate jumps across their territory. Dawson leaned back in his chair. How long until they change the cipher? Based on what we know about their security protocols, probably 60 to 90 cycles. They are not fast at this kind of thing. Their systems were designed to fight each other, not to adapt to an enemy that steals their playbook. Good, Dawson said. That gives us enough time. Tell me about broken chains. Cross opened a thin file on the table. There were no digital screens in this room. Everything was on paper, by design. She spread out a series of hand-drawn diagrams and technical notes. Broken chains has two parts, she said. The first part is the warheads. I have been working on them for 7 years, and they are ready. They use a fusion compression method that I developed at Prometheus Station. When a warhead detonates near an enemy ship, it does not explode in the traditional sense. Instead, it creates a contained energy pulse that interacts with the target's power core. The pulse forces the core into a cascading shutdown. Every system on the ship dies. Engines, weapons, shields, life support, gravity, everything. The ship goes completely dark. But the crew survives, Dawson said. Yes, the crew survives. They float in the dark, alive but helpless, until someone comes to pick them up or their emergency oxygen runs out. That is the point. A destroyed ship is just wreckage. A dark ship full of living, terrified people broadcasting distress signals on every frequency. That is something much worse. That is a message. And the second part? Cross put away the technical diagrams and pulled out a different set of papers. These covered in names, dates, and locations. The second part is not a weapon. It is an idea. She pointed to a list of species names. The Ven, the Tassari, the Umi, the Drayan, the Sullen. Every one of these species was conquered by the Council centuries ago and forced into the tributary system. They serve the Council because they have no choice, not because they believe in what the Council stands for. Their ships make up nearly 40% of Cole's fleet. You want to turn them, Dawson said. I want to give them a choice, Cross corrected. We have had intelligence operatives working inside Council space for years, building contacts, learning languages, understanding grievances. These species hate the Council. They have hated the Council for generations. They have never had someone strong enough to stand against the Council and survive. She looked Dawson in the eye. We just survived. Now we give them the choice that nobody ever gave them. Stand down. Stop fighting for the people who conquered you. And when this war is over, we will remember who chose peace. Dawson was quiet for a long time. He looked at the papers, then at Cross, then at the blank concrete wall behind her. Finally he said, Do it. Both parts. Full deployment. Within 10 cycles, the operation began. Human intelligence agents embedded in Council space activated their networks and began transmitting targeted messages to military officers and government officials among the tributary species. The messages were simple, personal, and carefully crafted. They did not ask anyone to betray their own people. They asked them to stop betraying themselves. A Ven carrier group stationed near the border of human space received new orders to advance on the colony of Harkin's Gate. The carrier group acknowledged the orders and then simply did not move. When the Council Command Center demanded an explanation, the Ven commander reported engine trouble on all 3 carriers simultaneously. No one believed the excuse, but no one could prove it was a lie. A Tassari supply convoy carrying fuel and ammunition to Cole's forward staging area diverted to a neutral port and requested political asylum. The convoy commander, a middle-aged Tassari named Gullen Das, told the Port Authority that he had no interest in dying for a war that was not his. and on a dozen different Council warships, UMI communications officers began making small, quiet mistakes. They transposed coordinates. They delayed relaying orders by just a few minutes. They accidentally left channels open during sensitive briefings, and the information that leaked somehow found its way to human listening posts within hours. The coalition was cracking, and it had barely fought a second battle. While the second prong of broken chains worked its slow poison, Captain Daniel Holt and the Ironclad were given a new mission. Using the navigation cipher from the captured data core, Holt's strike group of 40 ships was ordered to jump deep behind Council lines and hit the supply depot at Oranthus Station itself, the same station where the Council had voted for war. The jump took 3 days. The strike group traveled through Council space using the enemy's own navigation routes, passing within detection range of at least 4 Council patrol zones. Each time, Sophie Garrett fed the patrol zone's identification codes into the Ironclad's transponder, and the human ships passed through without challenge. The Council's own security system let them walk right in. They arrived at Oranthus at the start of the station's night cycle, when activity was at its lowest. The supply depot was a massive orbital structure on the far side of the station, connected to it by a chain of docking bridges. Inside it were 3 full cycles worth of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts, enough to keep Cole's fleet running for months. Holt did not hesitate. The strike group dropped out of faster-than-light travel at close range and opened fire on the depot before the station's defense systems could even power up. The depot's thin armor was designed to protect against accidents, not against warships. It broke apart under the human barrage like glass under a hammer. Fuel tanks exploded in chains of brilliant white fire. Ammunition stores cooked off in cascading detonations that sent shockwaves rippling across the station's shields. Docking bridges snapped and tumbled into the void. The entire attack lasted less than 8 minutes. By the time Council defense ships scrambled from the far side of the station, the depot was a field of burning wreckage, and the human strike group was already turning to leave. But before they jumped, Holt did one more thing. He opened a broadcast on every open channel, Council military, civilian, diplomatic, all of them, and spoke in a calm, steady voice that translators carried to every ear on the station and every ship in the system. This is Captain Daniel Holt of the human warship Ironclad. 6 cycles ago, this station held a vote. 47 species sat in a room and decided that my people did not deserve to exist as a free civilization. 38 of you voted yes. You called us weeds. You called us an infestation. And then you sent 12,000 ships to our border to teach us our place. He paused for one heartbeat. Every one of you. Remember that. The Ironclad jumped. The channel went dead. And in his private chamber aboard the station, Counselor Jiren Fall sat in the dark and watched the replay of the broadcast for the 3rd time. His mandibles were trembling. He told himself it was anger. He told himself it was outrage at the audacity of these primitive, short-lived creatures who dared to strike at the heart of Council power. But deep in the part of his mind that he never showed to anyone, he knew the truth. It was not anger. It was the first cold touch of something he had not felt in over 200 years of political life. It was fear. And across the galaxy, in the war rooms of Earth and the corridors of Council warships, and the quiet homes of tributary species who had spent centuries under someone else's boot, the same thought echoed in 1,000 different languages. The humans are not running. The humans are coming. The Council declared war on humans and ignited their own doom. Part 4. The Siege of Sol. War Marshal Draven Cole stood alone in his quarters aboard the Wrath of Oranthus and stared at the star map on his wall. The map showed the current state of the war, and it was not a map he enjoyed looking at. Red markers indicated lost ships. Yellow markers indicated ships that had defected or gone silent. There were far too many of both, In the 60 cycles since the war began, he had lost almost 3,000 ships, some to human attacks, some to the minefields and traps that seemed to appear everywhere his fleet went, and some to the quiet, creeping disease of desertion that was eating through his coalition from the inside. Every day brought new reports of tributary species refusing orders, delaying movements, or simply disappearing from their assigned positions. His fleet, which had once numbered over 12,000, was now closer to 7,000, and not all of those could be trusted to fight. The humans, meanwhile, had lost fewer than 50 ships. 50 against 3,000. Cole had fought wars his entire life, and he had never seen a ratio like that. It was not natural, it was not fair, but more than anything, it was not sustainable. If the war continued at this pace, his coalition would bleed out within 6 months, and the council would be left with nothing. So Cole made a decision. He would stop fighting the humans on their terms and force them to fight on his. He would take the war to the one place humans could not afford to lose, their home. He assembled every ship he still trusted, 7,000 warships, organized into 10 battle groups, each one commanded by an officer he had personally chosen for loyalty above all else. The tributary species ships that remained were placed in the center of the formation where they could be watched. Cole loaded his fleet with every weapon, every piece of ammunition, and every drop of fuel he had left. There would be no reserve, no fallback. This was everything. The fleet jumped to the Sol system on a cold Tuesday morning, Earth time. Admiral Nate Dawson was drinking coffee in the war room when the first alert came in. Long-range sensors at the edge of the system detected the fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel. 7,000 contacts, arriving in a wall of energy signatures so dense that the sensors initially thought it was a malfunction. Dawson set his coffee down, looked at the display, and said, "Well, he is finally done playing around." The human defense network activated. It was not large, but it was layered and deep. Orbital weapons platforms ringed Earth and Mars, each one carrying enough firepower to take down a capital ship. Asteroid fortresses, hollowed-out rocks fitted with armor, shields, and heavy guns, floated in calculated positions throughout the system. The home fleet, just under 200 warships, formed up between Mars and Earth in a defensive formation that Sophie Garrett had designed specifically for this scenario. And behind the warships, answering a call that had gone out to every human in the system, came everything else. Colony ships with welded-on gun mounts, cargo haulers carrying improvised missile racks, mining vessels with industrial lasers repurposed as weapons. Civilian transports, loaded with volunteers who had never fired a shot in combat, but who refused to sit on the ground and wait. Humanity fought with everything it had, because everything it had was all there was. Cole's fleet advanced in a massive wedge formation, pushing through the outer system with sheer weight of numbers. The first line of asteroid fortresses opened fire at extreme range, and the battle began. The outer defense ring held for 6 hours. Every fortress fought until it was silenced or destroyed. The crews did not retreat. They did not surrender. When their guns were knocked out, they detonated their ammunition stores and took enemy ships with them. It was not enough to stop the advance, but it was enough to cost Cole over 400 ships before he even reached the inner system. The second line was the orbital platforms around Mars. Dr. Lillian Cross was aboard Mars Station when the Council fleet entered weapons range. She had spent the last several weeks preparing the station for this moment, loading it with every Broken Chains warhead that the Prometheus program had produced. She watched the approaching fleet on her display, counted the contacts, and made a quiet calculation in her head. "Not yet," she murmured. "Closer. Let them get closer." The battle around Mars was vicious. Council ships poured fire into the orbital platforms, and the platforms fired back with everything they had. Human warships darted through the gaps in the formation, hitting targets of opportunity, and pulling back before they could be pinned down. Explosions lit up the space around the red planet, like a second sun. For the first time in the war, human losses were heavy. Dozens of warships were destroyed. Thousands of lives were lost. A cargo ship crewed entirely by civilian volunteers from the colony on Europa took a direct hit and broke apart, and the communication channels carried the sound of the crew's last transmission, a woman's voice, steady and clear, saying, "Tell my kids we did not run." Captain Holt and the Ironclad held the center of the defensive line at the choke point between Mars and Earth. The ship was taking hits from multiple directions, its shields flickering and its hull groaning under the strain. On the bridge, Sophie Garrett coordinated the movements of the remaining fleet with a focus so intense that she did not blink for minutes at a time, her hands flying across her console as she redirected ships, called out targets, and calculated firing solutions faster than the ship's own computers. "3 carriers pushing through Sector 7, she called out. "If they break through, they have a clear line to Earth's orbital ring." He had 8 ships available to block that corridor. The carriers had an escort of 50. "Send all 8, he said. "Tell them to hold that line, no matter what." The 8 human ships moved to intercept. They fought with a ferocity that made the Council escort captains hesitate, which was exactly the wrong thing to do against an enemy that never hesitated. 2 human ships were destroyed. The other 6 held the line until reinforcements arrived. The carriers never reached Earth. Below decks on the Ironclad, Eddie Voss was having a very bad day. Council boarding parties had breached the hull in 3 places, and his Marine squad was the only thing standing between them and the ship's critical systems. He fought in the corridors with his team, moving from junction to junction, using the ship's narrow passages to negate the enemy's numbers. A squad of Kethrin heavy soldiers, each one twice Voss's size, pushed through a breach near the engine room. Voss and Katie Park held the corridor for 11 minutes with nothing but rifles and determination. When his rifle's power cell ran dry, Voss picked up a piece of broken hull plating and used it as a shield while Park reloaded. When Park went down with a wound to her shoulder, Voss dragged her behind cover, sealed the wound with a field patch, and kept fighting. They held the corridor. The boarding party fell back. Voss leaned against the wall, breathing hard, covered in sweat and blood that was mostly not his, and said to Park, "I am absolutely going to open that bar after this." Then Dr. Cross made her move. From Mars Station, she launched the Broken Chains warheads, hundreds of them, fired in a coordinated barrage that spread across the entire Council formation. The warheads moved fast, too fast for point defense systems to track, and they detonated in precise positions calculated to maximize their effect. The result was something no one in the galaxy had ever seen before. Hundreds of Council ships died without being destroyed. Their power cores collapsed, their lights went out, their engines stopped. They drifted, dark and silent, like stones sinking in deep water. No explosions, no fire, just silence. And inside those ships, tens of thousands of crew members were alive, floating in the dark, listening to their own breathing and the sound of nothing else. The sight of it broke something in the Council fleet. Ships that had been fighting hard suddenly slowed. Officers who had been shouting orders went quiet, and then the defection started. Then warships powered down their weapons and broadcast surrender signals. Tassari cruisers broke formation and turned away from the battle. Omi communication ships stopped relaying orders entirely, and without communications, entire battle groups lost coordination and fell into confusion. Cole watched it happen from his command deck. He stood perfectly still as the tactical display turned from a picture of a battle into a picture of a collapse. His fleet was not being defeated. It was falling apart. The coalition that the Council had built on fear and obligation was dissolving in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "All ships," he said, his voice rough and low. "All loyal ships, retreat, fall back to Rally Point 7, retreat now." Fewer than 2,000 ships answered the call. The rest were dark, destroyed, surrendered, or gone. The siege of Sol was over. Captain Holt stood on the bridge of the ironclad and looked out at the field of drifting council ships. The viewport was cracked in 2 places. The bridge smelled like burned wiring and recycled air. Half the consoles were dark, but the ship was alive, and Earth was safe, and the council fleet was broken beyond any hope of repair. Sophie Garrett appeared beside him. She had a cut on her cheek, and her uniform was torn at the shoulder, but her eyes were clear. "The Admiral is requesting a status report," she said. Holt nodded. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark shapes of dead ships tumble slowly against the backdrop of stars. "Send a message to the Admiral," he said. "Tell him it is time to finish this." Garrett looked at him. "Just that?" "Just that. He will know what it means." She sent the message, and in the war room beneath the Rockies, Nate Dawson received it, read it once, and began making the calls that would end not just a war, but an entire age of galactic history. The Council declared war on humans and ignited their own doom. Part 5. The New Order. 6 standard months after the Siege of Sol, the galaxy was a different place. What remained of the Council's military had either surrendered, defected, or retreated to home systems under ceasefire agreements negotiated through back channels. The Great Coalition fleet that had once numbered 12,000 warships no longer existed. Its pieces were scattered across a dozen systems, some as wreckage, some as dark hulks that had been towed to salvage yards, and some flying under new flags, crewed by species that had decided they were done taking orders from Oranthus. War Marshal Draven Cole had been captured during the retreat. His flagship, the Wrath of Oranthus, was disabled by a broken chains warhead while trying to jump out of the Sol system. Human Marines boarded the ship and found Cole standing on his command deck, alone, his officers having fled to the lower decks. He did not resist. He simply looked at the human soldiers who entered the bridge, studied their faces behind their helmets, and extended his wrists for binding. He was transported to a detention facility on the moon. He was given a clean room, regular meals, medical attention, and access to reading material. No one struck him, no one humiliated him, no one made him kneel. When a young human guard brought him his evening meal on the 3rd day, Cole looked at the tray of food, and then looked at the guard. "Why do you feed me this well?" he asked. The guard, a kid from a small town in Ohio, who had enlisted 8 months ago and never expected to be serving dinner to an alien war marshal, shrugged and said, "Because you are a prisoner, not an animal. There is a difference." Cole said nothing. He ate his meal in silence, but he thought about that answer for a very long time. On Earth, Admiral Nate Dawson organized a diplomatic fleet. 12 warships, led by the Ironclad, accompanied by 3 diplomatic transports carrying Ambassador Kira Sloan and her team. The fleet was not large enough to threaten anyone. It was large enough to make a statement. Captain Daniel Holt brought the Ironclad into orbit above Oranthus. He stood on the bridge and looked down at the station world where the vote for war had been cast 6 months and a lifetime ago. The crystal spires of the council chamber were visible from orbit, catching the light of the system star and throwing it back in pale rainbows. Sophie Garrett stood beside him. "Standing orders?" she asked. "Hold position," Holt said. "Weapons cold. Shields at passive. We are not here to scare anyone." "And if they try something?" Holt looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. Not quite a smile, but close to one. "Sophie, they are not going to try anything. Not anymore." No one tried anything. Ambassador Kira Sloan took a shuttle down to the station and walk through the same corridors she had walked 6 months ago, past the same crystal walls that hummed with the same low vibration. But everything else was different. The corridors were half empty. Many of the species delegations had packed up and left. Display screens that had once shown the proud symbols of 47 spacefaring civilizations now showed gaps and blank spaces where emblems had been removed. Sloane entered the council chamber. It felt smaller than she remembered, though nothing about its physical dimensions had changed. The seats were mostly empty. Of the 47 delegations that had filled the room on the day of the vote, only 23 remained. Some species had withdrawn from the council entirely. Others had simply stopped showing up and ignored all communications. Councillor Jiren Thal was still there. He stood at his dais, the same place where he had called humanity a weed, but he did not stand the way he used to. His forearms hung loosely at his sides, and his compound eyes had lost their sharp, confident gleam. He looked like what he was, a leader who had led his people into a disaster and had run out of ways to pretend otherwise. Sloane took her position at the human section, the same seat in the far corner near the door. She looked at Jiren Thal and waited. The chamber was silent. "Ambassador Sloane," Jiren Thal said at last. His voice was quieter than before. The translator carried it faithfully, including the slight tremor he could not quite hide. "You have returned." "I have," Sloane said, "and I have brought terms." A ripple of tension moved through the remaining delegates. This was the moment they had been dreading. Every conquered species in galactic history knew what came next. The victor presented its demands, and the defeated accepted them or faced worse. Territory, tribute, submission. The strong took from the weak, and the cycle continued as it always had. Sloane opened a thin document folder, actual paper, a human tradition she had chosen deliberately, and read the terms aloud. Term 1. The tributary system is dissolved, effective immediately and permanently. Every species currently bound by tributary obligations is released from all duties, debts, and military service commitments to the Council. They are free. The chamber went dead silent. Several delegates looked at each other, confused, as if they had not heard correctly. Term 2. A new interstellar charter will be established, guaranteeing the sovereignty and self-determination of every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, regardless of age, size, or military strength. No species may be conquered, subjugated, or forced into service by another. This charter will be open for all species to sign, including every current member of the Council. Still silence. A Venn observer in the gallery, who had come expecting to watch the Council be humiliated, leaned forward in his seat with his mouth open. Term 3. A formal acknowledgement will be entered into the permanent galactic record, stating that the Galactic Ruling Council initiated an unprovoked war of aggression against the human species, and that the human species defended itself and prevailed. Sloane closed the folder and looked up. That is all. The silence stretched for a long, long time. Delegates looked at each other, at Sloane, at Jiren Thal. A Drayan representative in the third row actually stood up, sat back down, and stood up again, as if his body could not decide what to do with the information it had just received. Jiren Thal stared at Sloane. His mandibles moved slowly, clicking and unclicking, in a pattern that his species used when processing something deeply confusing. "That is all?" he repeated. "That is all. You are not demanding territory? No. You are not demanding tribute or reparations? No. You are not installing a military governor or a puppet government? No." Jiren Thal's voice dropped low, almost to a whisper. "Why? You won. Your fleet sits in orbit above this station. You have weapons that can shut down every ship we have left. You could take everything. Why would you not? Sloane looked at him steadily. She did not blink. She did not look away. And when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the great chamber and to every translator in every delegation. Because we have already been conquerors, she said. We did it to each other for 10,000 years. We burned our own cities. We enslaved our own people. We built weapons that could destroy our own world, and we pointed them at ourselves. And then, at the very edge of our own extinction, we stopped. We made a choice. We decided that the cycle of conquest and submission and revenge was not strength. It was a trap, and we climbed out of it. She paused. You clearly have not learned that lesson yet, but we are not going to teach it to you by becoming what you were. That is not who we are. Not anymore. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the crystal walls was the loudest sound in the room. Gyrenthal lowered his head. He did not speak for a long time. Then slowly, he pressed his 4 palms flat against the surface of the dais, a gesture in his culture that meant acceptance without reservation, and said, "The terms are accepted." In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed faster than anyone had imagined possible. The Ven sent a formal delegation to Earth, the first time they had engaged in independent diplomacy in over 300 years. The Tassari trade guilds opened direct negotiations for commercial partnerships with human colonies. The Umi, who had been silent and obedient for so long that most species had forgotten they had their own culture, transmitted a planet-wide broadcast on their homeworld announcing their freedom. And the celebrations lasted for 7 days. 12 former council species signed the new charter within the first month. By the 3rd month, the number had risen to 30. Dr. Lillian Cross returned to Mars and began the process of dismantling the Broken Chains warhead program. She did it personally, supervising the disassembly of each warhead by hand. A reporter from an Earth News network visited the station and asked her why she would destroy her greatest achievement, the weapon that had won the war. Cross looked at the reporter with tired, honest eyes and said, "Because the point was never to have it. The point was to never need it again." Sergeant Eddie Voss retired from active service with full honors. He took his savings, packed a bag, and flew to Bleeker's Reach, the mining colony where the first battle of the war had been fought. The colony had been rebuilt in the months since, and new settlers were arriving every week. Voss found a good spot near the main settlement, leased a building, and opened a bar. He called it First Round. Katie Park, whose shoulder had healed, but who walked with a slight limp, she refused to get corrected because she said it made her look tough, became his first employee and permanent business partner. The bar became the most popular spot on the colony within a month, not because of the drinks, but because of the stories. Admiral Nate Dawson resigned his commission 6 months after the war ended. He moved to a cabin in the mountains of Colorado, not far from the bunker where he had commanded the defense of the human race. He told no one where he was going. He did not give interviews or write memoirs. He simply left. And when people asked why, the only answer anyone could find was something he had said to a junior officer on his last day. "I spent my whole life getting ready for a war I hoped would never come. It came, and we survived. That is enough for one lifetime." And Captain Daniel Holt remained in command of the Ironclad. The ship was repaired, refitted, and returned to service as the flagship of the new United Earth Exploration Fleet, because humanity, having survived its greatest test, decided that the best thing to do next was to keep going forward. In the final hours before the Ironclad departed on its first exploration mission beyond the borders of known space, Holt sat alone on the bridge. The ship was quiet. The crew was resting. The stars outside the viewport were still and bright and endless. Sophie Garrett appeared with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Holt and sat down in the chair next to his. They watched the sun rise over the curve of the earth, painting the clouds in shades of gold and orange that no alien species had ever seen from this exact angle. After a long, comfortable silence, Sophie spoke. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. "The peace, the charter, all of it?" Holt took a sip of his coffee. He thought about the question for a while, the way he thought about everything, carefully, quietly, without rushing. "It will last," he said, "exactly as long as they remember what happens when it does not." Sophie nodded. She did not say anything else. Neither did he. The ironclad's engines hummed to life, and the ship turned its nose toward the unknown, and the stars waited. The Council declared war on humans and ignited their own doom. Part 1. The vote that lit the fuse. The Great Chamber on Arenthis was the largest room ever built by any species in the known galaxy. Its walls were made of living crystal that hummed with a low, steady vibration, and the ceiling arched so high above the floor that clouds sometimes formed beneath it. 47 delegations sat in their assigned sections, each one representing a species that had earned its place among the stars. Some had been spacefaring for 10,000 years, others for 5,000. The youngest among them, the humans, had achieved faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago, and they had exactly one seat in the far corner of the chamber, close to the door, as if they were guests who might be asked to leave at any moment. Counselor Gyrenthal stood at the central dais. He was tall, even by the standards of his own kind. His body was covered in dark, armored plates, and his forearms rested on the stone podium as he looked out at the assembled delegates with compound eyes that reflected the light like wet glass. He was the supreme voice of the Galactic Ruling Council, and when he spoke, the translator systems embedded in the chamber walls carried his words to every ear in every language simultaneously. "Fellow members of the Council," Gyrenthal began, his mandibles clicking between sentences, "I bring before you today a matter of great urgency and great importance. For 6 decades, we have watched the species known as humans spread through the outer systems with a speed and aggression that has no equal in our recorded history. They have colonized 14 star systems. They have refused, repeatedly and without apology, to submit to the tributary system that every younger species before them has accepted. They build warships when they should be building offerings. They train soldiers when they should be training diplomats." He paused and let the silence sit for a moment. The delegates shifted in their seats. Some nodded, others stayed still. "I do not come before you with hatred," Gyrenthal continued. "I come before you with a warning. Humanity is a weed. If we do not cut it now, while it is small, it will grow roots so deep that no force in this galaxy will be able to pull it out. I call for a formal vote on the immediate and unconditional subjugation of the human species." The chamber erupted. Delegates from dozens of species began talking at once. Some shouted support, others raised objections. The noise was enormous, a wall of sound in 100 languages, but through it all, one voice cut clean and clear. "I would like to speak." Ambassador Kira Sloan stood in the human section, alone. She was not tall. She was not physically impressive by the standards of most species in the room. She wore a simple dark uniform, with no decoration except a small silver pin on her collar that represented Earth. Her hair was pulled back, and her face showed nothing. No fear, no anger, nothing at all. She waited until the chamber quieted, and then she spoke. "Counselor Thal," she said, "I have listened to your words, and I want to make sure I understand them correctly. You are asking this body to declare war on a species that has not attacked you, has not threatened you, and has not violated a single treaty or agreement. You want to do this because we are growing too fast for your comfort. Is that a fair summary?" Gyrenthal mandibles twitched. "It is a simplification." "Then let me simplify something for you," Sloan said. She looked around the chamber slowly, making eye contact with as many delegates as she could. 3 times in the last 40 years, independent species from this council have sent raiding parties into human space. The Drenari hit our colony on Bleeker's Reach. The Vaxi tried to blockade our trade route through the Colden Strait. And just 11 years ago, a Kethran war fleet of 80 ships crossed our border and attacked a civilian transport convoy. She let that sit for a moment. Every single one of those aggressions ended the same way. Badly. Not for us, for them. The Drenari lost their entire raiding force in 6 hours. The Vaxi blockade collapsed in 3 days. And the Kethran fleet, all 80 ships, was destroyed in a single engagement by a human defense group 1/3 its size. The chamber was quiet now. Very quiet. I am not telling you this to boast, Sloane continued. I am telling you this because you need to understand something fundamental about my species. We do not want war. We have never wanted war. But we have been fighting wars since before we could write our own names. We fought each other for 10,000 years on a single planet. And we did not stop until we had weapons that could burn that planet to ash. We looked at those weapons and we looked at each other, and we made a choice. We chose to stop. We chose to reach for the stars instead. She pointed at Zyrenthal. Do not force us to make a different choice. The silence that followed lasted almost 10 full seconds. Then Zyrenthal spoke again. The human ambassador's passion is noted. The vote will proceed. And it did. The delegations cast their votes one by one. 38 voted in favor of war. 9 voted against. The motion passed. War Marshal Draven Call, a massive reptilian commander with scales the color of dried blood and a reputation for crushing rebellions across 3 sectors, was given command of a coalition fleet of over 12,000 warships. He had 30 standard cycles to assemble and deploy. Sloane watched the final tally appear on the display above the dais. She did not react. She did not argue. She simply turned, walked out of the chamber, and returned to her ship. Before the airlock sealed behind her, she sent a single coded transmission to Earth. It arrived 14 minutes later in the office of Admiral Nate Dawson, deep inside the United Earth Defense Command headquarters, buried beneath the Rocky Mountains. Dawson was a broad man in his 60s, with gray hair cut close to his skull, and hands that still carried scars from ground combat 30 years ago. He read the transmission once. He read it again. Then he deleted it and pressed the intercom on his desk. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," he said. "All of them. Now." Within the hour, every senior military commander on Earth and across the 14 colonies was linked into a secure channel. Dawson stood in front of a holographic star map that showed the full extent of human-controlled space. 14 small dots of light, surrounded on all sides by the vast, sprawling territories of the Council species. It looked like a handful of sparks, lost in an ocean of darkness. Dawson looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at the faces of his commanders. 60 years ago, he said quietly, we left Earth because we thought the universe might have something better waiting for us. We built colonies. We opened trade routes. We raised families on worlds that had never known a human footprint. And now, 47 species that have been running this galaxy since before we had electricity have decided that we do not deserve any of it. He tapped the map, and the 14 human systems pulsed with soft white light. They have 12,000 ships. We have just under 300. They have supply lines that stretch across half the galaxy. We have 14 colonies, and whatever we can build in 30 cycles. He paused. And they think that is enough to beat us? A thin smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that had no warmth in it at all. They just made the last mistake they will ever make. He turned back to the map, and the meeting began. Across the galaxy aboard his enormous flagship, War Marshal Draven Cole was reviewing the human military profiles his intelligence officers had assembled. He flipped through the data with mild interest, Small fleet, limited resources, young species, no allies. He closed the file and looked out the viewport at the thousands of warships assembling around his command vessel. He felt nothing close to worry. This would be quick. This would be easy. He had crushed rebellions before, dozens of them, and the humans were just another name on a long list. In 30 cycles, he would bring them to heel, and the council would reward him as it always did. He did not know that in a small research station on Mars, a woman named Lillian Cross was reading the same intelligence reports, except hers were about the council fleet, and she was smiling too. But her smile was very, very different from his. It was the smile of someone who had been preparing for this moment for 7 years.